I got an interesting letter from Korambo regarding the Chauvin trial verdict. And I'm going to go ahead and read it. Brent Spiner sent me an email. He said, "Dearest Gail, myself and all the members on Church of Gail watched the live verdict of the George Floyd case on television today. The case appears to be a hot issue in American politics right now. And we had an old friend reach out to us regarding the verdict. In fact, she was recently here visiting us on Church of Gail. Korambo sat watching the television with furrowed brow, resting her chin on her big black fist. Flashes of live news coverage glowed across her glasses. As the verdict in the case of George Floyd was read, her expressions didn't seem to change. For a moment, she continued to stare at the television as if in a state of solemn knowing. She then sat back in her chair with a heavy sigh and brought her black fist to her chest to pray. Once she was finished, she got up from her chair and went to her desk to start writing. An hour later, she appeared at my quarters with a paper in her hand. "Give this to President Gail," she instructed me. "She is a great leader, and I know she can deliver the good word to her people in the United States." The following speech was written by Korambo the gorilla, addressing the humans of the United States. "My fellow apes, today the entire world heard the historic verdict in the case of a terrible crime that happened in the land of the United States. Indeed, this case was a tragedy on many levels. However, to understand the wisdom I am about to impart, I must tell you the story of an event that happened in my homeland of Africa. Once upon a time in Africa, there was a gorilla who our troops referred to as Curious George. Curious George was most known in the gorilla community for his habit of gorging himself on the leaf of the coca plant. This plant has a stimulant effect and can cause erratic behavior in gorillas. One day, while high on a belly full of coca leaves, Curious George wandered into a human village. Thinking he was a people, he wandered up to a human vendor selling fruit and started stealing their bananas. Nowadays in the jungle, the gorillas follow the Korambo commandments, no free bananas. But Curious George, because he was so physically imposing and was too high to care about the human vendors, stole the bananas that day. When the vendor asked Curious George to pay for the bananas, Curious George simply gave the vendor a handful of dry banana leaves. The vendor declined to accept Curious George's banana leaves, explaining that humans have an economic system and require money. Curious George, not understanding this concept and very high on coca, began whooping and screaming, baring his fangs and slapping his chest. The human vendor, scared of this wild gorilla and concerned with the banana theft, called animal control. Curious George simply stuffed his mouth with the stolen bananas and left the vendor's booth. His attention quickly turned to the site of a nearby coca plant. Excited, Curious George went to the plant to eat more of his favorite leaves. When animal control arrived, they recognized Curious George. This was far from the first time they had gotten a call about an aggressive, coca-eating gorilla harassing the local humans in their village. This particular gorilla had a history of breaking into human homes and stealing their belongings, raping their wives, and even threatening to kill their pregnant women. Animal control knew this individual was a dangerous gorilla. They found Curious George stuffing his face full of coca leaves. Officer Scapegoat, who had dealt with this gorilla many times previously, was particularly frustrated. "Curious George," he said, "you are under arrest. You must come with me now to Animal Control Precinct. There you will be caged and then returned back to the jungle where you came from." Curious George, thinking the humans were there to take away his coca leaves, began eating them like a pig, gorging them down until his belly swelled out like a balloon. "Curious George," Officer Scapegoat commanded, "that's enough. You're under arrest." Officer Scapegoat bravely approached Curious George and muzzled him. The gorilla, now angry and very high on coca leaves, began to flail and scream. "That's enough, Curious George," Officer Scapegoat scolded. "Calm down so that we can put you into the transport vehicle." Curious George, realizing he was in trouble, began to scream even louder. He yelled out to all the humans passing by, "Don't kill me! I'm not a bad monkey!" "Calm down, Curious George," Officer Scapegoat yelled over him. "You're not being killed. You're being taken into animal control custody. To be honest, after all the crimes you've committed, you're lucky you haven't already received the death penalty. But you're probably going to get released right back into the wild like you always have. Now settle down." Curious George continued his shenanigans, now huffing and puffing. "Don't kill me! I'm not a bad monkey! Don't!" Suddenly, Curious George began to cough and choke. Officer Scapegoat, assuming Curious George was simply still throwing a tantrum, held on until backup arrived. He couldn't allow this dangerous gorilla to escape. When the other animal control officers arrived, they came to a shocking realization. Curious George was dead. Animal control rushed Curious George to the veterinarian, who determined upon autopsy that Curious George had suffered a heart attack due to overdosing on coca. It was a tragic case of a gorilla who had gone down a bad path in gorillahood. When Officer Scapegoat was called back to the village the next day, he was flabbergasted by what he saw. The entire village was under siege by all the gorillas of the jungle. "Don't kill me," the gorillas chanted. "I'm not a bad monkey," echoing the last words of Curious George. All of the gorillas of the jungle were avenging the death of Curious George. But, Officer Scapegoat thought, nobody is killing these gorillas. Curious George was caught committing a crime and was the only gorilla involved, and he wasn't even killed. Everyone knows he died from a coca overdose. The riot was so destructive it burned down the entire human village and all the surrounding jungles where the gorillas lived. The gorillas lost their own homes, their own food, and even burnt down the animal welfare offices of the human village that were giving them free bananas. Officer Scapegoat, who became the primary target of the gorillas, was eventually killed. His head was placed on a stake in the middle of the burnt-down jungle where all the gorillas would come to scream and slap their chests in anger. Yet, after all the destruction of the local human villages and even the death of Officer Scapegoat himself, the local gorillas were still not happy. "No justice, no peace," the gorillas chanted, spreading out into the next villages to continue their riots as they screamed, "Don't kill me, I'm not a bad monkey." The guerrilla riots moved from village to village. Guerrillas burned, pillaged, looted, and destroyed everything they touched in an effort to avenge the death of Curious George. While most would assume that Curious George was a dearly beloved member of the guerrilla troops to have caused so much outcry over his death, the truth was far more peculiar. Most of the gorillas didn't know Curious George at all. In fact, Curious George was the type of gorilla that even other gorillas avoided, as he was prone to violence, rape, and banana theft. Had he died while eating too many coca leaves by himself in his cave, none of the other gorillas would have cared, and the female gorillas he raped and assaulted while they were pregnant would have even been relieved. The local ecosystems collapsed. Pretty soon, all of the humans of Africa avoided gorillas and enacted strict measures to keep them far away from their villages. It wasn't long before humans were looking at every gorilla they saw and thinking, what a bad monkey. That is the story of Curious George. Humans of the United States, your emotional thinking has overtaken your faculties of logic. Your lack of self-value has caused you to identify yourself with the color of your pelt and not the content of your character. Stories teach louder than lectures. I urge you all to think about the story of Curious George. His story contains a dire lesson about the raw realities of species relations, about species identity, and how to restore peace among your people in the United States. Your peaceful gorilla, Korambo. Well, thank you, Korambo. That was a very well written letter. Yes. I would like to say that as U.S. President, I have updated my conspiracy law because of the Derek Chauvin verdict. And I'm going to try to make it so that law enforcement can do their job fairly, justly, and effectively. So I will have a link. I have actually printed a transcript of the letter that Korambo wrote. And you can view the link. And also on that page, I have put the update to my conspiracy law, which I would like all of law enforcement in all conspiracy law honoring countries to read and honor. Basically, we have a violence program, which is mandatory for law enforcement to use, which will determine whether the person who is a suspect deserves to be arrested and how to handle them. So anyways, just go ahead and check the link underneath this video for this latest update to my conspiracy law. And for my opinion on the Chauvin verdict. And very well said. I don't really want to add too much to what Korambo wrote because she said it beautifully. Couldn't be said any better. Though I do want you to know that I have updated my conspiracy law to help out the United States in this matter.